Right now, while you're watching this video, there's a room somewhere in the world where decisions are being made that will affect your job, your savings, and your future. And you weren't invited. In fact, most people don't even know these rooms exist. Here's the truth behind how the world actually works. There's a network of ultra-wealthy individuals who meet regularly, share information before it becomes public, and coordinate moves that shape entire economies. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's documented fact. And by the end of this video, you'll see exactly how it operates. I'm going to reveal 3 massive things that will shock you. First, the secret meetings where billionaires plan their next moves together. Second, the hidden connections between companies you think are competitors. And third, the one strategy they all use that regular investors never hear about until it's too late. Let me show you exactly how this happened. To understand this network, you need to know why it exists and why it matters right now more than ever. The global economy isn't run by governments anymore. It's run by whoever controls the capital. And here's what most people miss. There are only about 2,600 billionaires on Earth, but together they control over $13 trillion. That's more wealth than the GDP of every country except the United States and China. But here's where it gets interesting. These people aren't scattered randomly across the globe, working independently. They're connected through overlapping investments, shared board seats, and exclusive gatherings that the public never hears about. Think about it like this. Imagine you're playing Monopoly, but while you're trying to buy properties one at a time, there's a group of players at another table who've already agreed to share their properties, trade information, and work together. You're not playing the same game anymore. You're playing against a coordinated team while thinking it's every person for themselves. The main characters in our story are the billionaire investors, the private equity firms, the sovereign wealth funds, and the family offices. These are the real power players. Family offices alone manage over $6 trillion, and most people have never even heard that term. Here's what matters now. We're at a unique moment in history. Interest rates just went through the biggest change in 40 years. Artificial intelligence is reshaping every industry, and there's more wealth concentrated in fewer hands than at any point since records began. This network has been preparing for these changes for years. They had advanced knowledge, they positioned themselves early, and regular people, they're finding out on the news after the moves have already been made. Let me give you a small example to keep things interesting. In 2008, while the housing market collapsed and regular people lost their homes, a small group of investors made billions by betting against the market. How did they know? They had access to information and analysis that wasn't available to the public. They saw the connections between banks, mortgages, and derivatives that regulators missed or ignored. That wasn't luck, that was access, and that access comes from being part of the network. Let me show you where things get really interesting.
Now here's where things get really interesting. Let me show you how this network actually operates in practice. The most powerful meeting most people have never heard of happens every single year in Davos, Switzerland. It's called the World Economic Forum. And while some of it is public, the real action happens in private rooms where billionaires, heads of state, and corporate leaders meet without cameras or reporters. But Davos is just the visible tip of the iceberg. There are dozens of other gatherings that are far more secretive. The Bilderberg meeting brings together about 150 of the world's most powerful people every year at a different luxury hotel. No press allowed. No minutes published, just closed-door conversations about global affairs, economics, and policy. Then there's the Allen & Company's Sun Valley Conference, nicknamed Summer Camp for Billionaires. This is where media moguls and tech titans meet every July in Idaho. Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, and dozens of other CEOs. What are they discussing? Nobody outside that conference knows for certain, but within weeks of these meetings, we often see major mergers, acquisitions, and strategic partnerships announced. Here's the shocking fact that most people never consider. These aren't just social gatherings, they're coordination meetings. Information gets shared before it becomes public. Investment opportunities get discussed before they're offered to markets. Strategic moves get planned collectively. Let me give you specific examples with real numbers so you can see this clearly. In 2016, before it became public knowledge, a small group of investors knew that interest rates would stay low for years. How? Because they had private conversations with central bankers at these conferences. While regular investors were worried about rate increases, this network was buying up assets that would benefit from continued low rates. They made billions while everyday investors sat on the sidelines waiting for rate hikes that never came. Here's another one. In 2019, several major investors started quietly positioning themselves for a technology boom in electric vehicles and AI, well before the pandemic accelerated these trends. Companies like Tesla saw their values explode in 2020 and 2021, but the smart money was already positioned years earlier. Why? Because they had access to industry leaders, researchers, and each other's insights at private conferences. The network also operates through shared investments. Look at any major company, and you'll find the same institutional investors show up repeatedly. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. These firms manage tens of trillions of dollars combined, and they're major shareholders in almost every large public company. When you own pieces of everything, you're not really competitors anymore. You're partners with aligned interests. Think about what this means for you and your life. When these firms simultaneously own large stakes in all the major airlines, what incentive is there for those airlines to truly compete on price? When the same investors own all the pharmaceutical companies, all the hospital chains, and all the insurance companies, whose interests are really being served? The visual storytelling element here is crucial. Picture a web with nodes representing each billionaire or institution. Now draw lines connecting them through shared investments, board seats, and conference attendance. What you'd see is that nearly every major player is connected to every other player within just 2 or 3 degrees of separation. But if you think that's crazy, wait until you hear this.
Most complex or surprising information comes in layers, and here's the next one that connects everything together. The network doesn't just share information. They've built a system where they literally cannot lose. Let me explain how. When regular people invest, they face real risk. If you buy a stock and it goes down, you lose money. Simple. But the Billionaire Network has created structures that eliminate most of their risk while keeping all the upside. It's a rigged game, and here's how they do it. First, there's the private equity model. Firms like Blackstone, KKR, and Apollo buy companies using mostly borrowed money. They make the company take on the debt, not themselves. Then they pay themselves massive fees for managing the company. Even if the company eventually fails, they've already extracted millions in fees. Heads they win, tails they don't lose. Here's a real example. A private equity firm buys a retail chain for $2 billion, using $300 million of their own money and $1.7 billion in debt. They immediately pay themselves a $50 million transaction fee. Then they pay themselves $20 million per year in management fees. After 3 years, even if the retail chain goes bankrupt, they've made $110 million on a $300 million investment. The workers lose their jobs, the vendors don't get paid, but the private equity firm profits. This happens thousands of times every year, and it's perfectly legal. The network has shaped the laws to make it legal. Second, there's insider information that isn't technically insider trading. When you sit on multiple corporate boards, belong to the same clubs, and attend the same conferences as CEOs, regulators, and policymakers, you hear things. You know which way regulations are heading before they're announced. You know which technologies are about to break through before patents are filed. You know which companies are struggling before their quarterly reports. None of this information comes from corporate insiders in a way that triggers insider trading laws, but the effect is the same. The network knows things before everyone else, and they position their investments accordingly. Here's where it gets even more interesting. The network uses something called layered complexity to hide what they're actually doing. They don't just own companies directly, they own them through holding companies, which are owned by other holding companies, which are owned by trusts, which are owned by foundations registered in different countries. Why? Because this complexity makes it nearly impossible to track who really owns what or who benefits from which decisions. It also provides enormous tax advantages. While regular people pay 30% or more of their income in taxes, billionaires often pay less than 10% because their wealth is structured through these complex layers. Let me give you the most surprising contrast to show how different their world is from yours. When the pandemic hit in 2020, over 20 million Americans lost their jobs in a single month. Meanwhile, American billionaires added over $1 trillion to their collective wealth in that same year. How is that possible during a global crisis? Because the network positioned themselves to benefit from the crisis. They knew governments would inject trillions in stimulus. They knew interest rates would drop to zero. They knew people stuck at home would boost tech and e-commerce companies. So they loaded up on exactly those assets while regular people were panicking and selling. This isn't hindsight bias. Many of these moves happened in February and March of 2020, right as the crisis began. The network saw the opportunity immediately because they understood how the system works. They knew governments would protect asset prices to prevent a total collapse. Think about what this means. The system is designed to transfer wealth upward during both good times and bad. During booms, asset prices rise and the wealthy own most of the assets. During busts, governments inject stimulus that flows primarily to assets and corporations, again benefiting the wealthy. The network didn't accidentally create this system. They built it intentionally through decades of lobbying, campaign contributions, and revolving doors between government and corporate positions. But this brings us to the most shocking discovery of all. The Wiese family isn't just running businesses and accumulating wealth, they're building a private economic system that operates parallel to the official economy, and they're positioning themselves to control essential resources as South Africa faces increasing economic pressure. Let me paint the bigger picture by connecting everything I've told you. Remember the retail empire? The property holdings, the food production and distribution? Now, watch what happens when you see how these pieces fit together into a larger strategy. The Wiese family has been quietly building control over critical supply chains. They don't just own stores, they own or have stakes in the trucks that deliver to those stores, the warehouses that supply those trucks, the food processors that fill those warehouses, and increasingly the farms that supply those processors. This vertical integration means that in their ecosystem, they capture value at every single step from farm to consumer. But here's the dramatic revelation that changes everything. As South Africa faces ongoing infrastructure problems, load shedding, logistics challenges, and economic instability, who do you think is positioned to survive and even thrive? The Wiese family has invested heavily in backup power systems, private logistics networks, and resilient supply chains. While other businesses struggle when Eskom fails, their operations continue. While other retailers can't get products to shelves due to logistics problems, they have alternative routes and methods. They're not just adapting to South Africa's challenges, they're building infrastructure that makes them indispensable during crisis and positions them to acquire distressed competitors who can't handle the operating environment. Here's evidence presented with dramatic impact. During the worst of South Africa's load shedding in recent years, while small retailers closed and even some large chains struggled, Shoprite reported record profits. How? Because they'd invested hundreds of millions in generators, solar power, and energy management systems that kept their stores running when competitors sat in darkness. This strategy reveals something profound about their long-term thinking. They're not trying to build the biggest empire in good times, they're building the most resilient empire that will dominate during bad times when everyone else fails. The Wiese family has also positioned themselves in water rights and agricultural land at a time when both resources are becoming increasingly scarce and valuable. As climate change affects rainfall patterns and water availability, whoever controls water and food production controls survival itself. Let me be clear about what's happening without sensationalizing. The Wisa family has looked at South Africa's trajectory, seen the infrastructure decay, the governance challenges, the resource constraints, and made a calculated decision. They're building private capacity to deliver essential goods and services regardless of what happens to public infrastructure. This makes them simultaneously more powerful and more necessary. In a country where government struggles to deliver basic services, private entities that can fill that gap gain enormous influence. Think about what this means for South Africa's future. As inequality grows and the middle class shrinks, more South Africans will depend on affordable retailers like Shoprite and Pep for necessities. The Wisa family will profit from economic decline because they dominate the value segment. They're positioned to benefit whether South Africa prospers or struggles. The dramatic conclusion is this: while other wealthy families might face pressure or criticism during economic hardship, the Wisa family will be seen as essential. They're not luxury providers that can be vilified. They're the people keeping food on shelves and affordable clothes accessible. This is brilliant strategy wrapped in social necessity, and it's why, despite their enormous wealth, they face far less public criticism than flashier billionaires. So, what does all this mean for regular South Africans?
So what does all this mean for us today as regular South Africans? Why should you personally care about this invisible empire? Because this family's dominance directly impacts your choices, your costs, and your economic future in ways you probably haven't realized. First, understand that when one entity controls this much of the retail landscape, you have less choice than you think. You might think you're choosing between different stores, but if they're all owned by the same family, you're not really choosing at all. The Wisa family's holdings span low-end, middle market, and increasingly premium retail. No matter where you shop in their universe, they profit. This concentration of ownership gives them enormous pricing power. When a family controls 40% of South Africa's grocery retail and 50% of affordable clothing retail, they can influence prices across entire categories. If they raise prices even 5%, what alternative do most South Africans have? The competition is limited because they've acquired or outcompeted most rivals. Let me give you future predictions based on these trends. As South Africa's economy continues struggling, we'll see more consolidation, not less. The Wisa family and a few other large players will acquire struggling chains and further concentrate ownership. Within 10 years, the top 3 retail entities will likely control 70 to 80% of South Africa's formal retail market. Second, your job security and working conditions are affected by this concentration. The Wisa empire employs hundreds of thousands of South Africans directly and supports hundreds of thousands more jobs indirectly. This gives them enormous influence over labor conditions. When you're one of the few employers operating at scale, you can set wages and conditions knowing workers have limited alternatives. It's not necessarily that they pay unfairly, but the competitive pressure that would normally force wages up is absent when there are few large employers. The personal impact comes down to this. Whether you work for them, shop with them, or compete with them, the Wisa family's decisions shape your economic reality. And because they operate privately, you have no visibility into how those decisions are made or what priorities drive them. But here's the broader context that offers some nuance. The Wisa family, for all their wealth and power, have also created genuine value. They've built efficient retail operations that deliver affordable goods to millions of people. They've created jobs in a country desperate for employment. They've invested in infrastructure when government couldn't or wouldn't. This isn't a simple story of villains exploiting people. It's more complex. They've built businesses that serve real needs while accumulating enormous private wealth in the process. The question South Africa faces is whether this model serves the country's long-term interests. The lessons for regular South Africans come down to awareness.
Understanding who controls the economy helps you make more informed decisions. It helps you understand why certain things cost what they do, why certain jobs pay what they pay, and why certain business models dominate. For entrepreneurs, understanding this landscape is crucial. Can you compete with an empire that controls supply chains, has economies of scale, and can outlast any downturn? Maybe not directly, but there are always niches, specialized offerings, and underserved markets where smaller operators can thrive. For employees, understanding your employer's broader ecosystem helps you assess stability and opportunity. Working for a visa company might offer more security than working for a struggling independent retailer, but it might offer less autonomy and slower advancement due to bureaucracy. For consumers, awareness helps you make choices that align with your values. If you prefer supporting smaller businesses, you can. If you prioritize price and convenience, you'll likely end up in the visa ecosystem, and that's fine too. The key is making conscious choices with full information. Before we wrap up, there's one final thing that ties this all together.